There are questions that should never be asked in the Imperium of Man, because once spoken, they begin to unravel truths that were buried for survival's sake. This is one of them. The Emperor of mankind is not supposed to fear. He is the architect of humanity's dominion, the mind that bent history into a single, brutal direction. He stood unflinching before gods that clawed at reality itself. He watched civilizations burn without remorse, worlds die without mourning, and suns fall without mercy. Fear is for mortals. Fear is for weakness. Fear is for those who do not see the future clearly. And yet, there was one moment, one presence, one impossible realization that forced even the Emperor to pause. Not because his life was threatened, but because his control was. To understand why this fear mattered, you must first understand what fear meant to the Emperor. It was not the instinctive terror of pain or death. Those things had lost meaning to him tens of thousands of years before the Imperium was ever dreamed into existence. His fear was colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. It was the fear of an equation breaking. The fear of a future no longer converging toward his design. The fear that something he had created was no longer moving along the path he had written for it, and worse, that it never truly had. The Primarchs were meant to be solutions. Weapons forged not merely of flesh and gene craft, but of purpose. Each one embodied a fragment of the Emperor's will, refined into a form that could conquer a galaxy. They were not accidents. They were not equals. They were instruments, brilliant, terrible, and replaceable if necessary. When some of them failed, the Emperor responded as a ruler responds to broken tools. Anger, disappointment, ruthless correction. When some of them turned against him, he did not fear them. He mourned the loss of efficiency. Even the greatest betrayal in human history did not shake him with fear. Horus inspired fury. Magnus inspired regret. Lorgar inspired contempt. None of them inspired hesitation. Fear only emerges when force is no longer the answer. There was one Primarch who did not fit cleanly into the Emperor's grand design. Not because he was weak, nor because he was disloyal, nor because he was flawed in the way the others were flawed. He was something far more unsettling. From the very beginning, there were signs, subtle, easily dismissed, buried beneath victories and compliance reports, that this Primarch was not simply following the Emperor's will. He was understanding it, not revering it, not obeying it, understanding it, and that distinction, though invisible to most, was enough to change everything. The Emperor had always assumed that knowledge was his greatest weapon. That truth, selectively revealed, could bind humanity together under his guidance. That ignorance, carefully enforced, would protect mankind from horrors it was not yet ready to face. The Imperium was built on this principle, that the Emperor alone knew enough to rule. But this Primarch began to see the fractures in that logic. Not through forbidden texts or demonic whispers, but through observation. Through inference. Through an instinctive grasp of reality that mirrored the Emperor's own, too closely. It was not rebellion that triggered the Emperor's fear. That would have been simple. Rebellion could be crushed, erased, rewritten into cautionary myth. No, the fear came from a far more dangerous realization. This Primarch did not need to rebel to destroy everything. He did not need to raise a legion against terror or strike a single blow. All he needed to do was act freely. To make choices unshaped by obedience, unrestrained by dogma, unblinded by the lies the Imperium told itself in order to keep breathing. For the first time, since the dark age of technology, the Emperor encountered something he could not simply dominate. A mind that was not defiant but independent. A will that did not seek the throne, yet was not bound to it. A presence that did not challenge his authority directly, but quietly existed outside of it. Chaos could be fought. Xenos could be exterminated. Treachery could be punished. But this was different. This was a mirror that did not reflect worship or hatred, only clarity. And clarity is terrifying when your entire empire depends on carefully maintained ignorance. The Emperor never spoke of this fear. He never recorded it. He never allowed it to shape policy in ways that could be traced. But fear does not need words to exist. It reveals itself in absence, in silence, in the knowledge withheld, the conversations never held, the truths carefully diverted away from one singular mind. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the Great Crusade, a calculation was made. Not about conquest, not about survival, but about containment. Because the Emperor understood one final, dreadful truth: if this Primarch ever chose to confront the Imperium with nothing more than the truth of what it was, the galaxy would not need to burn to end. It would simply stop believing. And that was something even the Master of Mankind could not allow. Before we speak of the Primarch who unsettled the Master of Mankind, we must first strip away the myths that surround the Emperor himself. Not the god-enthroned corpse worshipped by a decaying Imperium, but the being he truly was during the Great Crusade, focused, relentless, and utterly convinced of his own inevitability. This is important, because fear cannot grow in a vacuum. It needs context. It needs contrast. And nothing contrasts fear more sharply than absolute certainty. The Emperor did not conquer the galaxy with hope. He conquered it with calculation. Every world brought to compliance, every culture erased or reshaped, every species exterminated was part of a single, uncompromising vision. Humanity would rule the stars, not because it deserved to, but because it was necessary. Chaos was real. Extinction was inevitable without unity. And unity, in the Emperor's mind, required control so total that free will itself became a liability. He understood this long before Terra ever flew the Aquila. This is why the Primarchs were created. Not as sons, not as heirs, but as extensions of his will, refined instruments designed to execute specific functions across a galaxy too vast for even him to dominate alone. Each Primarch embodied a solution to a problem the Emperor could not solve personally. War, compliance, inspiration, terror, governance, faith, reason. They were not meant to question why they were made. They were meant to work. And for the most part, they did. When Angron broke, the Emperor saw a failed weapon. When Lorgar knelt before false gods, he saw a flaw in design. When Magnus reached too far, he saw hubris, a predictable outcome of forbidden curiosity. Even Horus, the greatest of them all, was ultimately just another variable that turned against expectation. A tragedy, yes. A catastrophe, certainly. But never an impossibility. The Emperor did not fear Horus. He calculated him incorrectly. That distinction matters more than it seems. Fear requires something else. Fear is born when calculation fails entirely. When a variable refuses to behave as a variable. When an outcome cannot be predicted, not because of randomness, but because of understanding. The Emperor could predict rebellion. He could predict corruption. He could even predict betrayal from those he trusted most. But there was one thing his plans never accounted for: a Primarch who could see the plan itself. This Primarch did not rage against destiny or curse the Emperor's lies. He did not seek forbidden power or divine approval. He did not demand answers. Instead, he observed. He listened. He noticed what was not being said. He noticed how truths were segmented, how knowledge was distributed like rationed air, how the Imperium's survival depended not on enlightenment but on enforced ignorance. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand the Emperor's greatest secret. That the Imperium was not built to last forever. It was built to last just long enough. The Emperor had always believed that he alone could bear the weight of that truth. That only he possessed the strength to see reality clearly without flinching. Humanity, he believed, needed lies the way lungs need oxygen. Remove them too quickly, and everything collapses. But this Primarch did not suffocate when exposed to the truth. He adapted to it. And that adaptation frightened the Emperor in a way no blade, no god, and no rebellion ever could. Because a Primarch who understands the light does not need to destroy it. He only needs to stop believing in it. And if you stay with me until the very end of this story, you will understand why that realization forced the Emperor to make a decision so quiet, so absolute, that even history itself was bent around it, leaving behind a fear that still echoes through the Imperium 10,000 years later. The answer lies not in what the Emperor could destroy, but in what he could not afford to lose. By the height of the Great Crusade, the Emperor of mankind had already won in every way that mattered. The galaxy was not yet fully conquered, but its fate was sealed. The Legiones Astartes advanced like a tidal force, the Primarchs at their heads, and world after world fell into compliance through awe, terror, or annihilation. To the Emperor, this was not conquest, it was correction. Humanity was being realigned onto the only path that ensured its survival. Everything else was noise. This was the mindset from which the Emperor ruled: inevitability. He did not react to events, he anticipated them. He did not gamble, he calculated. Every Primarch had been engineered with a purpose already assigned, a role already envisioned long before they ever drew breath. Even their personalities, their flaws, their excesses were tolerances built into the design. Some were meant to inspire. Some were meant to terrify. Some were meant to rule. Some were meant to break things so utterly that nothing could rise again. The Emperor understood that perfection was not required, obedience was. That is why betrayal, when it came, did not shock him in the way history later claimed. It hurt the Imperium. It scarred reality. It cost him everything. But it did not surprise him. He had always known that some of his sons would fail. The heresy was not a failure of foresight, it was a failure of containment. A miscalculation, not an impossibility. And miscalculations could be corrected, even at terrible cost. Fear, however, does not come from miscalculation. Fear comes from realizing that your assumptions were never valid to begin with. The Emperor believed that knowledge was hierarchical, that truth could be safely divided, portioned, controlled. He believed that he alone stood at the summit, seeing the full shape of reality, while everyone else saw only fragments. This belief was the foundation of the Imperium. It justified secrecy. It justified censorship. It justified atrocity. Because if only one being truly understood the stakes, then only one being could be trusted to decide humanity's fate. And for thousands of years, that belief held. Until one of his sons demonstrated something the Emperor had never intended to create. This Primarch did not simply execute orders. He interpreted them. He did not merely follow doctrine. He analyzed its purpose. Where others accepted the Emperor's silence as divine mystery or strategic necessity, this Primarch recognized it as deliberate omission. He noticed patterns in what was taught and what was forbidden. He saw how the imperial truth was less a revelation and more a barrier, designed not to enlighten humanity, but to protect it from truths it could not yet endure. Most Primarchs never questioned this contradiction. Some embraced it, some resented it, but none of them truly understood it. This one did, and that understanding was dangerous because it was quiet. There were no confrontations, no accusations, no demands for answers. The Primarch continued to serve, continued to conquer, continued to deliver results that were, on paper, flawless. But beneath that obedience was something the Emperor could feel even across the void, a mind no longer anchored by faith in the system it served. The Emperor began to realize that this Primarch was not bound by the same limitations as the others. Loyalty did not define him. Fear did not restrain him. Even ambition failed to explain him. He did not seek to rule the Imperium, nor to reshape it in his image. He sought something far more unsettling: coherence. A universe where lies were unnecessary, where humanity faced reality without myth or false comfort. And the Emperor knew, with absolute certainty, that humanity was not ready for that. In that moment, fear finally took form, not as panic, but as restraint. The Emperor did not strike. He did not rebuke. He did not correct. Instead, he did something far more revealing. He began to withhold, to distance, to redirect. Because he understood that once a mind like this was fully unleashed, it could not be put back into ignorance. And if that mind ever chose to speak plainly, to explain the Imperium to itself, then the Emperor's greatest creation would unravel without a single shot being fired. This was the beginning of a silent divergence. Not a rebellion, not a fall, but a growing awareness on both sides that something fundamental had gone wrong, not with loyalty but with design. And from that point onward, the Emperor of Mankind no longer viewed this Primarch as a son, a general, or even a weapon. He viewed him as a risk. At first, the Emperor attempted to dismiss the feeling. After all, he had engineered minds capable of staggering intellect and perception. Several of his sons were philosophers, strategists, and visionaries in their own right. Intelligence alone was not a threat. But this was not merely intelligence. This was alignment. The Primarch in question was beginning to think along the same conceptual pathways as the Emperor himself, arriving at similar conclusions, but without the same emotional anchors, without the same self-imposed restraints. Where the Emperor carried the weight of millennia, compromise, and long-buried guilt, this Primarch carried clarity. And clarity, untempered by fear or sentiment, can be catastrophic. The Emperor had always justified his secrecy as necessity. Chaos was too corrosive, the truth of the warp too destabilizing. Humanity, left to its own devices, would fall back into superstition, worship, and self-destruction. That was the lesson of Old Knight. That was the scar burned into his memory. So he lied, not out of cruelty, but out of control. He told humanity that gods were myths, that demons were delusions, that reason alone would guide them forward. The lie worked, because most people needed it too. But this Primarch began to see the lie as scaffolding rather than foundation. He understood that the imperial truth was not meant to be permanent. It was a transitional myth, designed to shepherd humanity from chaos into unity, from ignorance into a controlled form of enlightenment. The problem was not that the Emperor lied. The problem was that the Emperor never intended to stop. And the Primarch could see where that path led, an Imperium frozen in fear of its own awakening, ruled eternally by a single will that decided what mankind was allowed to know. This was not heresy. It was not dissent. It was analysis. The Emperor sensed it in subtle ways. Orders executed with precision, yet interpreted with an unsettling degree of independence. Campaigns concluded not just with victory, but with social structures reorganized in ways that reduced reliance on dogma. Populations left compliant not because they feared the Imperium, but because they understood its logic. These were not mistakes. They were improvements. And that was precisely the problem. An Imperium that could understand itself did not need an Emperor. That realization struck deeper than any betrayal ever could. Because betrayal is emotional. It is loud. It announces itself in blood and fire. This was quiet. This was inevitable. The Emperor began to understand that if this Primarch were ever allowed full access to forbidden knowledge, if he were ever told the truth of the warp, of chaos, of the long war being fought beyond time itself, he would not break as others had. He would not fall. He would not worship. He would integrate it. And integration would change everything. Chaos feeds on extremes. Faith, despair, ambition, rage. The Emperor knew this better than anyone. That was why he had engineered the Imperium to be blunt, rigid, and emotionally constrained. It was ugly, but it was stable. This Primarch, however, represented balance. Not balance between good and evil, but between truth and function. A mind capable of acknowledging horror without kneeling before it. A will capable of confronting gods without believing in them. Even chaos recoils from such minds. This is why the Emperor's fear sharpened into certainty. He was not afraid that this Primarch would overthrow him. He was afraid that he would make him obsolete. That the Imperium, exposed to a clearer vision of reality, would no longer accept eternal rule by a hidden hand. That humanity might choose a harder, more honest path, one that did not require a god-emperor to shepherd it forever. So the Emperor did what he always did when faced with an uncontrollable variable. He isolated it, not through chains or censure, but through distance. Through silence. Through the careful denial of context. This Primarch was given wars to fight, sectors to pacify, responsibilities vast enough to keep him occupied, but never answers. Never the final pieces of the puzzle. Never confirmation of the conclusions he was already drawing. The Emperor hoped, perhaps, that time would dull the edge of insight. That duty would replace curiosity. That isolation would erode clarity. But isolation does not break a mind that understands itself. It only gives it more time to think. And somewhere in the vastness of the Great Crusade, as the Imperium marched ever closer to its blood-soaked zenith, two beings, father and son, became aware of a truth neither would ever speak aloud. One had created a future that depended on ignorance. The other had been born capable of seeing past it. By the time the Emperor fully grasped the depth of the problem, it was already too late to correct it. The Primarch had crossed an invisible threshold, one that could not be uncrossed. He no longer sought answers because he no longer needed them. He had inferred enough to see the outline of the Emperor's grand design, and more importantly, its limits. Where others saw a divine plan or a flawless strategy, he saw something far more fragile, a system balanced on silence, maintained through selective truth, and destined to collapse the moment humanity became truly self-aware. This was not arrogance. It was not resentment. It was not ambition. That was what made it so dangerous. The Emperor had always assumed that knowledge led inevitably to rebellion or corruption. That was the pattern history had taught him. Those who learned too much either tried to seize power or were consumed by forces beyond their control. But this Primarch did neither. He did not seek to replace the Emperor, nor did he reject him. Instead, he reached a far more unsettling conclusion, that the Emperor was necessary only because humanity had been kept dependent. That thought alone was enough to doom worlds. The Primarch began to see the Imperium as a contradiction given form. It preached reason while enforcing superstition. It denied gods while constructing one in all but name. It promised unity while institutionalizing ignorance. These were not moral objections. They were structural flaws. And unlike rebellion, structural flaws cannot be crushed with armies. This is why the Emperor never confronted him. Confrontation would confirm too much. It would validate conclusions that had never been spoken aloud. Silence, on the other hand, preserved ambiguity. It allowed the Emperor to pretend, if only to himself, that this was still a problem that could be managed. That distance could substitute for resolution. That time, as it always had, would solve what force could not. But time was the one variable neither of them fully controlled. As the Great Crusade thundered onward, the Imperium growing ever larger and ever more fragile beneath its own contradictions, the Emperor and this Primarch existed in a state of mutual awareness. No accusations, no declarations, only an unspoken understanding that one of them was building an empire that could not survive the truth, and the other was living proof that the truth could no longer be contained. And in that quiet, unresolved tension, something far more dangerous than rebellion was born. A future where the Emperor might win every war, and still lose everything. The Emperor began to notice the consequences not in defiance but in absence. Reports arrived polished, efficient, immaculate, and strangely incomplete. Victories were absolute, yet they left behind societies that did not cling to imperial ritual as tightly as others did. Compliance was achieved without excessive terror, without grand displays of myth or superstition. Instead, worlds under this Primarch's influence emerged organized, rational, and unsettlingly self-sufficient. They obeyed the Imperium, but they did not revere it. To most, this would have seemed like success. To the Emperor, it was a warning. The Imperium was never meant to produce citizens who understood it too well. It was meant to produce subjects who accepted it. Faith, fear, and tradition were tools as vital as bolters and battleships. Strip those away too quickly, and people began to ask questions. Questions led to doubt. Doubt led to fracture. The Emperor had seen this cycle play out across millennia, and he had learned, at unbearable cost, that humanity survived not through truth alone, but through carefully managed illusion. Yet this Primarch was quietly undoing that balance. Not through speeches, not through proclamations, but through structure, through systems that rewarded competence over obedience, through institutions that functioned even in the absence of direct imperial oversight, through governance that did not require constant reinforcement by myth. These were not rebellions, they were refinements, and refinements, when they spread, are far harder to stop than revolutions. The Emperor realized then that this Primarch was not trying to replace him. He was preparing humanity to exist without him. That realization carried a terrible weight. Because the Emperor did not fear death. He feared irrelevance, not for his own sake, but for what it would mean for humanity if he were removed too soon. The galaxy was still infested with predators that reason alone could not defeat. Chaos was patient, eternal, waiting for moments of transition and uncertainty. An Imperium that shed its myths before it was ready would not become enlightened, it would become vulnerable. And this Primarch, knowingly or not, was accelerating that risk. The Emperor considered intervention, direct correction, reassignment, even erasure. All were possible. He had done worse for less. But every option carried consequences he could not predict. To punish success would raise questions. To confront insight would confirm it. To destroy this Primarch outright would tear a hole in the Imperium's narrative so vast that even the most loyal would feel it. So he chose the only option that preserved control. He did nothing. At least, nothing visible. Orders continued. Campaigns continued. Praise was issued where praise was due. But the flow of information narrowed. Access to certain truths became restricted. Subtle barriers were placed between this Primarch and the deeper mechanisms of the Imperium. Not walls, but filters. Not commands, but omissions. The Emperor hoped to starve the problem of context, to let understanding wither without nourishment. But understanding, once formed, does not starve easily. The Primarch noticed the change immediately. He did not protest it. He did not question it. He simply adjusted. If knowledge was denied, he worked with inference. If answers were withheld, he refined his models. The absence of information became data in itself. Every silence from Terra confirmed that his conclusions were correct. The Emperor was not guiding him. He was avoiding him. And avoidance is the clearest admission of all. For the first time, the Primarch considered the possibility that the Emperor was afraid. Not afraid of rebellion. Not afraid of defeat. Afraid of what would happen if humanity learned to stand without a single, unquestioned authority at its center. Afraid that the Imperium's survival strategy, ignorance enforced as virtue, might ultimately be its greatest weakness. This did not harden the Primarch against the Emperor. It saddened him, because he could now see the tragedy at the heart of the Imperium. A ruler powerful enough to reshape the galaxy, yet unable to trust his own species with the truth. A civilization capable of greatness, yet forced to crawl forward under the weight of necessary lies. The Emperor was not a tyrant in his eyes. He was a custodian who had lost faith that his charge could ever mature. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was what made this Primarch dangerous. He did not hate the Emperor. He understood him, and understanding does not demand rebellion. It demands resolution. As the Great Crusade pushed onward toward its inevitable breaking point, both creator and creation carried the same unspoken question, one born of fear, restraint, and impossible responsibility. How long can an empire survive when its future has already begun to outgrow its past? Understanding brought with it a burden heavier than ignorance. Once the Primarch fully grasped the shape of the Imperium's lie, he also understood the consequences of exposing it. Truth was not a blade you could swing once and be done with. It was a force that reshaped everything it touched. To reveal too much, too soon, would not liberate humanity, it would fracture it. Worlds would burn not in rebellion, but in confusion. Faith would collapse faster than reason could replace it. And into that chaos, the warp would eagerly reach. The Primarch knew this. That was the final, terrible irony. He understood the Emperor's fear because he now shared it. Where the Emperor responded by tightening his grip, By burying truth deeper beneath dogma and ritual, the Primarch responded with restraint. He did not accelerate his reforms. He did not spread his ideas beyond the systems he directly governed. He slowed himself deliberately, aware that even unintentional influence could destabilize the wider Imperium. In doing so, he made a choice no other Primarch ever truly made. He limited his own potential for the sake of humanity's survival. This choice went unnoticed by almost everyone. To the Imperium, he remained a loyal son. Efficient, reliable, quiet, not prone to excess or grandstanding. He was not mythologized like some, nor feared like others. His name did not echo through propaganda or prayer halls. He existed in the margins of history, precisely because he never forced himself into its center. And that obscurity was not an accident. It was self-imposed. The Emperor sensed this restraint, and it deepened his unease rather than easing it. A Primarch who rebels can be hunted. A Primarch who hesitates must be watched. The Emperor realized that this was not a contest of power, but of patience. Both of them were waiting. Both of them were measuring the Imperium's resilience against the truth it was not yet ready to face. And neither of them could afford to be wrong. This silent stalemate created a tension that permeated everything around it. The Primarch's legion reflected his temperament, disciplined, adaptable, and less reliant on dogma than most. They were loyal, but not blindly so. Efficient, but not cruel for cruelty's sake. To outsiders, they were simply another force of compliance. To the Emperor, they were a controlled variable that could never be allowed to expand too far. Because if this mindset spread unchecked, it would change the Imperium in ways no war ever could. The Primarch began to see the wider pattern taking shape. He could feel the pressure building across the galaxy, the Emperor withdrawing more and more into projects no one fully understood, the Primarchs left to govern an empire that was already showing signs of strain. Faith was creeping back in despite official denial. Superstition was replacing reason at the edges. The lie was becoming heavier, not lighter. And lies, when stretched too far, eventually snap. He understood then that the coming catastrophe, the great civil war that would one day consume the Imperium, was not truly about betrayal or chaos. It was about truth arriving in a form humanity could not process. Some would embrace it as divinity. Some would weaponize it. Some would try to erase it. The galaxy would burn not because knowledge existed, but because it had been denied for too long. The Primarch could see it coming. And that knowledge placed him in an impossible position. If he intervened, he would validate the Emperor's fear. If he remained silent, he would become complicit in what followed. The Emperor, for his part, had reached a grim conclusion of his own. This Primarch was not a problem that could be solved. He was a condition that had to be endured. As long as he remained contained, isolated, unprovoked, and unacknowledged, the Imperium could stagger forward. But if circumstances ever forced this Primarch to choose openly, the consequences would be irreversible. Thus, an unspoken agreement formed. Not a pact, not a reconciliation, but a mutual understanding born of shared dread. The Emperor would not confront him. The Primarch would not act. And the Imperium would continue, balanced precariously between ignorance and awakening. For a time, it worked. But history is not kind to balances that rely on silence. Because silence does not prevent catastrophe. It only delays the moment when someone else speaks. The galaxy did not fracture all at once. It never does. Instead, it began with pressure, subtle, accumulating, invisible to those who did not know where to look. The Primarch felt it long before the first shots of the coming war were fired. Patterns in command decisions. Shifts in the Emperor's priorities. The growing absence of guidance from Terra, replaced by urgency, secrecy, and distance. The Imperium was entering a phase where the lie had to work harder than ever to hold reality together. And lies strain when they are overused. The Emperor withdrew further, pouring his attention into hidden projects whose purpose was known only to him. To most, this appeared as confidence, a ruler so assured of victory that he no longer needed to personally oversee the crusade. To the Primarch, it was something else entirely. It was retreat, not from the galaxy, but from accountability. The Emperor was narrowing the scope of truth even further, tightening the circle of those allowed to understand what was really at stake. That decision would cost him more than he ever anticipated. Because as the Emperor receded, the Primarchs were left to fill the vacuum. And most of them were not equipped to do so. Some ruled through fear, some through worship, some through brute force. Each of them embodied a distortion of the imperial truth, shaped by personality and trauma rather than design. The Imperium began to fracture into ideological fault lines long before the first formal betrayal ever occurred. The Primarch watched this unfold with growing certainty. He did not need foresight or prophecy to see where it led. The Imperium was no longer being guided, it was being held together by inertia. By momentum. By the sheer scale of what had already been built. And inertia, once disrupted, does not slow gently. It collapses catastrophically. Others would later claim that the Great Civil War erupted because of ambition, pride, or the whispering of dark gods. Those things mattered, yes, but they were accelerants, not causes. The true cause was simpler and far more damning. The Imperium had been denied the truth for too long. When fragments of it began to surface, through forbidden knowledge, half-understood visions, and corrupted revelations, the result was not enlightenment. It was confusion. The Primarch knew that once truth arrived distorted, it could never be corrected cleanly. A lie can be replaced by a better lie. But a shattered truth breeds extremes. Some would cling to it as faith. Some would weaponize it. Some would try to suppress it entirely. And in that chaos, the Emperor's worst fear would come to pass. Not that humanity would learn the truth, but that it would learn it badly. This was the moment the Primarch could have acted. He could have intervened, could have confronted his brothers, could have forced a reckoning before the galaxy tore itself apart. He had the intellect, the authority, and the insight to do so. But he also understood the cost. To act now would be to tear away the last illusion of unity. It would expose the Emperor's silence, validate centuries of doubt, and fracture the Imperium along lines that might never heal. So once again, he chose restraint. And that choice haunted him. Because restraint, when mistaken for passivity, invites others to fill the void. As tensions rose and loyalties began to shift, louder voices drowned out quieter ones. Those who demanded certainty, faith, and absolute answers gained influence. Nuance vanished. Complexity became weakness. The Imperium did not want clarity, it wanted comfort. And comfort, in a universe like this, always comes at a terrible price. The Emperor, watching events spiral beyond his direct control, felt the weight of his earlier fear return with crushing force. Not because the Primarch had acted, but because he had been right. The Imperium was breaking exactly where it had always been weakest, at the boundary between ignorance and truth. And now, with the coming war inevitable, there would be no clean resolution. Only survival, bought with blood and myth. Somewhere in the widening darkness, the Primarch understood that the moment for subtlety was ending. Not because he desired action, but because history rarely allows restraint to endure forever. Forces were moving now that neither he nor the Emperor could fully contain. The lie was unraveling, and when it finally snapped, it would not ask who was ready. It would only ask who remained standing. And in the quiet before the storm, one truth became inescapable to both creator and creation alike. Fear had never been about what this Primarch might do. It had always been about what the galaxy would become. Once he was no longer the only one who understood. By the time the first fractures appeared in the Imperium's structure, the Emperor had already recognized the full scope of the problem. He knew that the Primarch in question had reached a level of awareness that made direct confrontation pointless. Any attempt to assert dominance, to realign his son to blind obedience, would not only fail, it would confirm everything the Primarch already suspected. The Emperor's fear was no longer abstract, it had become strategic. He did not fear the Primarch's strength, nor his loyalty, nor even his capacity for rebellion. He feared clarity. This clarity was precise, unflinching, and unstoppable. Where other Primarchs might let emotion, ambition, or ideology cloud judgment, this one saw the entire system as it truly was. He understood its strengths and weaknesses, its hypocrisies and necessities, its fragility masked by years of enforced myth. He could calculate outcomes not only in battles, but in the hearts and minds of billions. And most dangerously of all, he could understand the Emperor's own constraints, motives, and fears. The Emperor had built an empire that thrived on obedience and faith, on blind trust in a vision only he fully understood. This Primarch, however, had transcended the need for faith. He did not blindly follow, yet he did not oppose. He simply understood. And understanding is more powerful, and more dangerous, than defiance, because it cannot be bargained with, coerced, or destroyed. It exists beyond control. The Emperor observed him indirectly, through reports, campaigns, and the subtle feedback of psychic resonance, and each observation deepened the same unnerving certainty. This Primarch could not be molded. He could not be deceived. He could not be relied upon to act in the ways the Emperor anticipated. In the calculus of war, he was no longer a variable, he was a constant. And constants do not conform to human expectations, they force adaptation. Yet the Primarch did not move recklessly. He did not challenge his father openly. He acted with discipline, achieving victories that were precise, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Every campaign he led reinforced his reputation as a loyal son, a brilliant strategist, a force that furthered the Emperor's vision. And therein lay the paradox. The Imperium continued to function, and yet the threat grew not through open rebellion, but through the very competence that had made him exceptional. The Emperor realized the truth. This Primarch had become a silent judge. Not of the Emperor personally, but of the Imperium itself. He could see the cracks, the lies, and the fragility of systems that millions relied upon blindly. And he could act at any moment if circumstances demanded it. The Emperor did not doubt that this son could destroy empires, legions, and entire belief systems without raising a weapon. He feared the inevitability of truth, and the timing of its revelation. From the Primarch's perspective, the Emperor's withdrawal was just another variable to account for. He did not resent it, nor did he interpret it as fear outright. He simply observed it as fact. The master of mankind had decided to contain him, and the Primarch responded with continued restraint, understanding that any misstep could trigger consequences far greater than immediate victory or defeat. And so the Imperium marched forward, oblivious to the silent tension that governed its fate. For every planet conquered, for every world brought into compliance, for every loyal legionary under his command, the Primarch's restraint held a quiet mirror to the Emperor's own anxiety. Two minds, intimately connected yet separated by the gulf of responsibility and insight, were shaping history without speaking a word to one another. This silent awareness, that both understood the stakes and yet refrained from action, was the true heartbeat of fear. It was not loud, it did not roar, it did not demand attention. It existed in quiet calculation, in withheld knowledge, and in the unspoken potential for devastation. The Emperor's fear was no longer just personal, it was existential. The galaxy itself was the board, and both players understood that a single miscalculation could end everything. And somewhere in the infinite darkness between them, the unacknowledged question lingered: if one of them could act, and the other could not stop him, how long could the Imperium survive its own truths? The final truth, the one the Emperor never spoke aloud and the one the Primarch carried in silence, was terrifying in its simplicity. The Imperium had always been built to endure ignorance, to thrive on belief, fear, and obedience. Its foundations were deception, carefully constructed hierarchies, and unyielding dogma.